Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be starting in just a second after I get the assorted links up going. And once we do, I've got a very exciting announcement before I get into tonight's topic. There's something in the works that those of you who follow me on Facebook should be aware of, but I'm going to talk about it a little more now. Um, it's, like I said, extremely cool. I'm so excited about this, and it's coming up in May. But again, I'll be with you all in just a second, as soon as I finish putting things where they need to be. Hi, Lisa for Truth. If you haven't seen it, make sure to check your messages on Facebook because I just sent you something very important about the big announcement I'm just about to make. Um, so, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. We're going to be talking about witches to continue this mythological folkloric theme I've been doing for the last few weeks. But before that, I'm going to talk about my big announcement. Those of you who follow me on Facebook should already be aware of this, but anyone who doesn't is about to get clued in. So, we're all stuck inside, which kind of sucks, doesn't it? Can't go out, you can't hang out with people, you can't go to conventions. I don't know about my listeners, but I love going to conventions. I love listening to various cool and interesting people speak. So, very first time ever, May 16th and May 17th, here on YouTube and some other places, I am hosting a convention. This is going to be a virtual convention. You can do it you can tune in from your own home. It's going to be live. I've got presenters. I'm going to get into who's coming in a minute. I've got presenters that are going to be giving talks. Um, I've gotten so many people already interested. We are doing both days. It looks like the 16th, the 17th, starting at 2 o'clock, probably around 1 o'clock, and running till I don't even know when yet. There will be live chat, so you'll be able to ask questions and interact to some degree with the people who are doing the performances. I cannot begin to describe how I'm excited about this. I am. So let me talk about who's joining us for certain already. These are people I've already talked to. They've already confirmed. We're just hammering out scheduled details now. John French, my good friend who's a retired CSI and a writer of horror and detective fiction. My buddy Patrick Thomas, who's also a writer of sci-fi fantasy type fiction. My friend, and yeah, you'll notice a lot of the people I'm going to pretty much all the people I'm going to announce are friends of mine, and all of them have been on the channel before. I am reaching out to people I haven't had on yet, but at the moment, that's where we stand. My erstwhile co-host with Brian McKinley, the vampire author, and Christopher Ryan, the hypnotist, are going to be giving presentations. My friend Alex Strang, who is a game designer, is going to do a game or some sort of very interactive type of thing that's going to involve the audience. My friend Lilith Lore is going to be doing some kind of performance. We haven't decided yet. Virgo Triad, one of the biggest names in the debunking of the sovereign citizens, is going to be coming on. She'll actually be probably our first presenter at 2 o'clock. And then I'm very happy to say that Dacre Stoker has been kind enough to join us once again. Those of you who don't know or have forgotten, he is a great grandnephew of the man himself, Bram Stoker, the man who wrote the novel Dracula. He has done his own extremely excellent work quite recently called Dracul, which is a prequel to Dracula. If you haven't read it, go check it out. I highly suggest it. All of these people are going to be here on. And for that matter, my friend Arthur Moyer, magician and occultist, is going to give his own presentation. All of these people are going to be here on YouTube, not on this channel. We're going to create a dedicated channel for this. You're going to be able to listen to all of them completely free of charge. It is everything you get at a convention that we could possibly reproduce online for free. And I've got some more surprises, some things into the works. One big thing we're looking at is going to be doing some charity stuff too throughout the day. Um, I would love if people want to support me. We want to make this a very big charitable event. We haven't decided yet. We're discussing either between trying to raise money for coronavirus relief or cancer research. It's probably going to depend on what the situation is looking like come May, because of the realities of Corona is still a serious issue. That's probably where the money should go. If things are looking up, maybe cancer always needs more money. But you're gonna have magicians, you're gonna have hypnotists, you're gonna have storytellers. John French is gonna be reading one or more of his short stories. I have an idea of what, because he and I have talked about. And he was kind enough to ask my opinions. The man writes amazing fiction. There's nothing he can read on this channel I wouldn't approve of, on this thing that I wouldn't approve of. So if anyone out there is listening and would like to help, we could use more great presenters. If you have a YouTube channel, if you've some published novels, if you know somebody who does, please, if you're a magician, a musician, anything like that, get in touch. Feel free to get in touch with me. We can talk about that. We're trying to work on a website. We could certainly use that if anybody's good with web design, because I don't have a bloody clue what I'm doing there. There are plenty of ways that you can help out. The beauty of this is that since it's all virtual and people are going out of their own homes, it's not going to cost us very much money. We found a software to use that isn't going to cost us anything. So the software is free. People are very generously giving their time to help out with this. So I'm not having to shell out a whole lot of money there. Shell out money there either. That's another big reason why it's like I don't want to charge you guys to listen, because it's not costing me anything. I have no costs to recoup. But I'd like to see money go to a worthwhile cause, which is why we're looking at the charity things. Which reminds me, one of the other things we're currently trying to work on the logistics of. There's a really cool storytelling game called Munchausen's. A bunch of people all sit together and you get the kernel of a story. So Kevin, tell me about the time that you flew to the moon using a giant thong, and then the storyteller, me in this case, has to come up with spin a 5-minute or so story about how that happened. And then other people, the other people at the table, people in the audience can get to change it around a little bit. And at the end, we have a vote for who had the best story. The vote will be decided by the audience, but to vote, you basically get one vote for every dollar you donate. Type of situation, and all of that money. I mean, we're not even going to do that through like super chat or anything like that. We're going to just it's going to be the donate button on that's available on the channel. So if you want to do this thing, you send money to the charity in question, and they get it, not me, because that's going to be the goal of that particular game. That's going to be. We've got some of our guests. Some people may be donating prizes. We may have a whole bunch of cool things going on there. More information will be available as we get closer to the event. Remember, May 16th, May 17th. Clear your days. It's a Saturday, Sunday. We're gonna have some exciting stuff, but that's gonna do it for the really big announcement. I hope people are as excited about this as I am. I've been wanting to run and that's the other thing I'll mention real quick but I've been wanting to run a convention for years. Long before I started a YouTube channel, I was talking about this idea, but the realities of money and all of that made it just unworkable. And I saw some other people doing this. I was at one just last weekend that was run by Vanishing Magic Inc. That whole bunch of magicians doing performances and lectures and things like that. It was a lot of fun to watch. Oh dang it, I forgot. There were the people behind Buffy the Vampire Slayer did one today. Apparently I had meant to watch and I completely forgot until just now. But this is an idea that is going around. It is really cool, and it gives us all something to do while cooped up inside. But again, and that's the last thing I was going to mention, which is the name of this event. Which is, we're calling it Wrath of Khan. And that's not con like the movie, that's CON, of course. Now let's get into tonight's topic, which is witches. Um, I want to start by defining what I mean by witch and the etymological origins of the word. And this is probably where I'm going to start losing people really quickly. And fantastic, Lisa, you're extremely welcome. We can talk more about that on Facebook and figure out what you'd like to speak about. Um, if anyone's wondering, yeah, I invited Lisa for Truth, who's one of my regular listeners and who has a great YouTube channel of her own that I recommend everybody go check out. Not right now, obviously, because you should listen to me live. But when you get a chance, go listen to her channel. She has some really interesting stuff on there, very good. At any rate, so what do people mean when they say the word witch? It has very different connotations. Like just like I said with werewolves, how it changes from country to country, time period to time period. Yes, that's correct. May 16th and 17th. The word witch has different connotations in different cultures throughout history. Um, there's basically three ways of defining a witch. There is a historical definition of a witch, an anthropological definition of witch, and then there's the Wiccan definition of a witch. So let's start with the easy one, which is etymologically, what does the word witch mean? The word witch, much like the word Wicca, is derived from Old English, and the word simply meant to bend or to change. It was a reference to the practice of magic. Um, and etymologically, the original roots, it isn't a religion. It's not evil. It's not good. It's just somebody who practices magic. Historically speaking, when the word witch first appears, you're talking about the Middle Christian Europe, the Middle Ages, and later. And when historically when people use the word witch, with respect to modern people who choose to use the word, people meant someone who was in league with the devil. Usually, someone who had made a deal with the devil, signed their name in the black book, and we're going to get into all of that, and sold their soul to Satan for magical power. In anthropology, when anthropologists talk about a witch, they have a very similar idea to that, but it's not quite the same. So in many cultures all over the world and throughout history, there's this idea of the witch doctor or the shaman, who is someone who practices what we would call magic, but he does it for the greater benefit of the tribe. If someone was possessed by an evil spirit, which is hardly a uniquely Christian idea, if someone was under a curse, if someone was ill, they went to the shaman or witch doctor who helped them. If, on the other hand, the other side, which are people who practice magic for destructive purpose, for personal gain, for destructive purpose, who would cast a spell on somebody else to harm them, a curse, summon evil spirits, and things of that nature. In anthropology, that second group of people are traditionally called witches. And then there's the third way that witches are defined, which started actually relatively recently in the 19th century with a woman by the name of Margaret Murray, I want to say. Let me double check. But she wrote a book. This woman wrote a book. Yeah, Margaret Murray, called the what the heck was the name of the book? Now I'm blanking. Something. Oh, The Witch Cults of Europe, in which she made the suggestion that there was an existent, or at one time existent in the Middle Ages and Renaissance and Reformation, religion within Europe that was actually that was practicing pagan beliefs and worshiping pagan deities. The church mistakenly associated with this idea of the devil worshipping witch. Her hypothesis, so known as the witch cult hypothesis, you can go ahead and look this up, is a lot of what forms the modern idea of witches. She had this idea, very much these ideas of the horn god, who was supposed to be a pagan god, associated with the Celtic Cernunnos, associated with the Greek Pan, but wasn't evil. It just god of the wild. and a god and a goddess, and a lot of these ideas that people now think of when you think of the word witch and Wiccan. But the idea, the religion of Wicca as it exists today, more than anything, owes its inception to a man by the name of Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was a 20th century occultist. He was an admirer of the late, one of the most infamous occultists of all time, which is Aleister Crowley. Crowley was not, on the other hand, a fan of Gardner. Oh, Gardner's the one who codified a lot of what we think of as modern witchcraft or Wicca, and this idea that it is a dualist religion that worships two gods, a god and goddess, that usually favors the goddess as the more important of the two, and sort of a counter religion to the Abrahamic deities, which are, of course, very male oriented with a male deity. Wicca itself, I'm sorry, there are a lot of Wiccans that get very upset when you say this, but from historical and anthropological perspective, Wicca is a modern religion. It is a religion. I am not calling a cult. It doesn't fall under the classifications of cult in any of the accepted means. Not that a cult's necessarily a negative thing, as I've talked about in other videos. I am not making a value judgment on whether Wicca is good or bad. I personally have known many Wiccans in my life, and I find them to, by and large, be wonderful, kind, compassionate people who I have no I have a difference of theological opinion with them because I'm a Christian, but I don't judge. I respect what they believe and consider that it a worthwhile belief for people to hold, whether I hold it myself or not. Hun?
What do you want?
Beer.
I don't think we have any more of those cider.
Ah. Oh, hey, Teresa, Hall Gold City Pagan. It's okay, you're late. This, I don't, see what the other one, even if we have it. Sorry you missed the big announcement. Go back or
bottle of water.
go back and watch the beginning earlier, or consider that by the Facebook or mostly the Facebook. Basically, we're doing a convention coming up in May, a big online virtual convention coming up in May. It's gonna be totally free to enter. We've got a lot of cool people coming, but back on track. So again, modern Wicca. A lot of Wiccans believe that it's an ancient religion that has been hidden from the world for hundreds of years because of Christianity's disrespect for the practice of magic. But from a hard historical stance, there's no written evidence, there's no documentation demonstrating that this religion has existed for hundreds of years. I've heard the arguments, I've heard the speculation. Again, I am not making a value judgment on the religion, on whether it's a worthwhile religion or not. But particularly this idea of a religion that worships a god and a god, specifically a god and a goddess, and practices the way that modern Wiccans do, there's no record of it going much further back than the early pre-World War I era, or excuse me, pre-World War II era. So my discussion today is primarily at this point going to be about the historical concept of the witch, which is hold on one moment.
Your food will be here in about 20 to 30 minutes. I ordered you a soda with it. Do you just want to wait for that?
Ice and this?
Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
That might be
Sorry about that. Arranging for food because I haven't eaten much today. But that's kind of the essential thesis here, is this historical concept of a witch. Which is well sourced, and there's a serious argument that can be made whether or not this really existed. And I think the answer, believe it or not, that in terms of the idea of a cult operating within parts of historical Europe, worshiping the devil, associated with at least some of the beliefs, whether they claimed at least to have some of the abilities and powers associated with witches in medieval folklore. I think there were groups that actually existed like this. What's interesting about saying that is that, yes, I think they existed. I think in large part, though, that may very well have been a reaction to the witch trials more than a cause of the witch trials. Um, what I mean when I say that is that um, there's always been this concept within the human psyche of kind of a counterculture movement of people. Well, sometimes people do things just to be contrary. Um, I think there's a definite possibility that people heard about these witches that were doing all these horrible things and getting power from the devil, and they thought, "Huh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if I could do that." Um, Certainly, the idea of witches, and this is another interesting thing I want to get into, of why the witch trials became such a common thing, and what and there's some interesting reasons behind that that actually have to do with, believe it or not, with climate change. But they pursued this for a number of reasons that make sense from an economic and a political standpoint, even if there's no denying what was done was horrible. So let's get into, first of all, what did witches do? I mean, I've defined what a witch in the sense I'm talking about means, but what did they do? They had a whole host of abilities depending on where in Europe you're talking about. Generally speaking, they were thought to be able to change form into animals. Um, they had a spirit helper or companion. Sometimes it was purely supposed to be one or more spirits. Sometimes it was seen as animals that could take the form of a spirit, that were demons in disguise, essentially. These familiars, which is probably a pretty common term that most of you have heard of, are also, by the way, why people think that black cats are bad luck. In the Middle Ages, people thought that demons would often, or witches would often take the shape of a black cat. So, you're coming across a demon or a witch doing its business. You may upset or anger them, and that's why it's unlucky. Um, you remember when we talked about werewolves again? Shapeshifting was a big common thing. There's also a lot of more fanciful ideas they got into. Supposedly on nights of the week, usually starting on Friday night after dark, they would fly to secret meeting places in the woods, either on staves or brooms, or on animals or on demons. And they'd hold these great late night orgies. The common thing people have said, and there's some truth to this, is that this is less a reflection of what people did and more a reflection of a bunch of horny old monks and priests sitting up in monasteries imagining what women got up to. Because, unsurprisingly, the vast majority of people that were accused of witchcraft in most places will come back to why I put that caveat in there. The vast majority of them were women. But there is actually some reality behind the idea of the witch's sabbat, and for that matter, flying on broomsticks. So the witch's sabbat is probably a whole, not something that happened in Europe so much, though maybe again because the story got so widespread, people said, "Hey, let's go have an orgy out in the woods in honor of Satan." But back in older times, particularly during the Greeks, yes, Lisa, lots of people have black cats. Black cats are not actually unlucky, but it is, of course, a popular superstition. But back during the time of the Greeks, worshippers of the god Dionysus, or as the Romans would later call him, Bacchus, would engage in, or are believed to have engaged in, drunken orgies, bacchanals. I mean, there's actually some record of this happening. It's thought that Christians, Christian monks, remember who was copying the various Roman and Greek records during the Middle Ages? It was the monks. Maybe came across these stories of these great orgies the Romans, who were definitely, and the Greeks, who were decidedly pagan, were getting up to in honor of the god of Dionysus slash Bacchus, the god of orgies and wine, and thought, oh, that must be what witches are doing now. So again, probably didn't actually happen all that much in the Middle Ages. Was a thing once upon a time, and the idea that was happening carried over. Now, flying about on broomsticks. This is a fun one. So, we've actually have from various witch trial records of the time and folklore records of the time recipes behind the flying about on a broomstick. Because you see, if you're a witch who wanted to fly, you would cover something, usually a staff or a broom, in a special ointment. Now, this ointment contained lots of disturbing oogie boogie ingredients, like, the fat of unbaptized children, human skulls, blah, 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 blah. But, okay, Paul. But what it actually included that's relevant to the discussion is things like belladonna, wolf's bane, both of which are very toxic, but they're also hallucinogenic. So you have this ointment made up of hallucinogenic drugs that is topically active, meaning you can absorb it through the skin. Now, the best place, as a general rule, the places in the body that it's most easy to absorb things through your skin are the moisture parts of the body. You're a woman. You're going to apply ointment to a damp part of your body that is going to give you this hallucination of flying about and doing all of these crazy things. What's a damp part of your body to apply it to? And then what long why would you maybe use a long rod-shaped object to do so? If you can't read between the lines, you might be a little young for this podcast or YouTube channel. But essentially, ladies and gentlemen, masturbation through the use, and good lord, is this probably gonna? If this was monetized, I probably would have just gotten myself demonetized. But masturbation through the use of hallucinogenic compounds is the origin of flying on a broomstick. And there are certainly records of people who claim to have this ability. I'll mention briefly later my favorite witch trial of all time, which happened here in the United States, specifically in Philadelphia, where the woman did quite openly admit in court that she flew about at night on a broomstick. Actually, I'll just tell you the story now. It's not a long story, but Swedish woman came to the United States. Her and her husband owned land along the Delaware River, and she was accused of witchcraft. She was brought before William Penn, the famous founder of Pennsylvania, and the governor at the time, and she was put on trial for being a witch. Yes, masturbation is perfectly normal. Although it's a little odd to be using it to have a religious experience. I'm not judging, but... And, owl splinters? Using wooden stabs and brooms? But I digress. So, she's put on trial for witchcraft. William Penn looks at her and goes, "Do you fly about at night on a broomstick?" Now, again, she was a Swedish immigrant. Her English was not great. She probably misunderstood the question. But needless to say, she says yes. William Penn looks at her, kind of scratches her head, and goes, "Well, we don't actually have a law against flying about at night on a broomstick." And ultimately, she was fined and sent home, and she was a wealthy woman. The fine was no big deal. Um, but yeah, that was the Philadelphia's witch trial, where the woman openly said, yes, she flew around at night on a broomstick. And the governor of the famous, very religious Quaker governor of Pennsylvania, William Penn, said, well, that's not illegal, so okay. Which is actually another really interesting idea you run into if you read the old medieval medieval records on witches. Even the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages made a distinction between satanic magic and natural magic. Satanic magic being magic done in league with Satan, of course, and then natural magic used God's natural law to perform magical acts. It expressly forbade, mostly, we'll get to that too, magic in league with Satan. But it considered magic in line with natural law acceptable. Because after all, you're only working with what God created. Since God created it and hasn't been corrupted by evil, it must be acceptable. The issue that they had was this line of which one is it? And as time went on, particularly as Protestant Reformation happened and some of the things going on, we're getting there, I promise. The line, they started to decide, we're really the only ones who can decide where that line is, so other people shouldn't be doing this. And here's another thing people often misunderstand. Yes, Christians actively executed people for the crime of witchcraft. The number of how many is probably in the hundreds of thousands. It is not in the millions, despite that ridiculous number of the burning times that people talk about. The way they arrived, by the way, if you're wondering, at I think it's 9 million witches being burned at the stake, is they took the number of executions that happened in the most prolific year of the witch trials and multiplied that number by all of the centuries the witch trials went on. The reality of the situation is, yeah, there are lots. Witch trials went on for hundreds of years. When they first started, often people weren't actually executed. Actually, in reality, of all the witch trials that happened in Europe, only about 30% of them ended in conviction, and the majority of those ended in banishment, not execution. I am not saying that makes it okay. People misunderstand that all the time, so let me be clear. I am not trying to defend or justify executing people for the crime of witchcraft at all. But what I am trying to do is encourage accurate information rather than hysteria. It is better to get the facts straight. I think we can all agree on that. What happened is morally wrong. It is not defensible, but don't blow it out of proportion. Here's the other thing, though, to realize about all of that. The idea of banning witches or banning the practice of magic didn't start with Christianity. The oldest laws against the practice of magic go all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi. Not the oldest, that was up for the longest time, but they've since found other ones. But one of the very oldest set of codified laws in human history actually talks about the practice of magic. Specifically, it treats using magic to commit a crime, like, for example, using magic to kill somebody, as killing somebody. Killing livestock is killing livestock, whether you go out and shoot it with a bow or you cast a spell and cause it to die. That idea continued. In point of fact, the Romans outlawed the practice of sorcery. One of the reasons that Nero and Caligula and the other Roman emperors who did so, because not all of them did, and to what degree depended greatly on the emperor, but one of the reasons they gave for why they executed Christians was practicing magic. But here's one of the ways that this gets interesting. Through the early history of the church, they go back and forth, the Roman Catholic Church specifically, they go back and forth on the question of whether or not witches actually are a thing. and whether magic is real and whether these people should be punished. One of the most important thinkers in Christian history, in Christian theology, Saint Augustine of Hippo, not only did not believe in witchcraft, he openly condemned the entire premise of there being witches. He wrote that to do these things, to be able to physically transform from a human into a beast, to be able to summon up storms, were things that only God himself could do. So to say that a mere human, or even a human in league with Satan, could do these feats was idolatry. It was giving a human the powers associated with God. It was wrong. It was heresy. So in the early part of church history, a lot of the times what actually happens is the church and the Inquisition. Because remember, come back to this in a second. But the Inquisition's job was not, for a lot of its history, was not actually hunting witches. The Inquisition would hear about an accused witch. They'd show up. They'd hear the evidence. The witch would be set free, and whoever made the accusation went to prison instead. Just as an aside on that note, yes, the Inquisition's official job was the punishment of heresy. Christian ideas that didn't conform to the Roman Catholic accepted theology. Witches technically qualify as a heresy, but again, until pretty late in church history, when you get towards the Protestant Reformation in particular, witchcraft was more of a civil crime than a religious crime. This, for example, is why in England and English colonies, witches were hanged, not burnt at the stake. Because they weren't being prosecuted for being witches. Nobody cared. They were being prosecuted for the crimes they committed using their powers. It's like, we don't care if you're practicing magic, but when you cast a curse that killed somebody, we have to prosecute you for that. This did change, which is where the real witch trials begin and where the real tragedy of the witch trials begins. And there's a political and economic reason why it changes. That is, while it's not right and it's not defensible, it's understandable. It's logical and even sane to a degree in a very Machiavellian, cruel sense. Because here's what happens. The drown. I'll come back to that. That's an excellent question. But Lisa for Truth says she thought that they were drowned. No, witches in English colonies were hanged. Where drowning does come in, because you're not entirely wrong, is one of the tests to see if someone was a witch. Was you threw them in the river, or you threw them in a lake. If they could swim, or they could float, the evil spirits are holding them up. Hang them. If they sank like a stone, they're innocent. But of course, the reality was they usually drowned. And for that matter, there are other times and other interpretations where if they floated, it was because their soul and heart were pure and God was holding them up. And if they didn't, oh, well, their evilness is weighing them down, and that's why they died. And let them drown. It was pretty much a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. There was always... This also... The damned if you do, damned if you don't really comes in during the Salem witch trials, which I'm getting there. The Salem witch trials were insane. England itself, not just the colonies, believe it or not. England itself, they were usually hanged. Because again, it was the witches in England and in some other places as well weren't being, and actually I'll come back to this in a second, but they weren't being prosecuted for their beliefs. They were being prosecuted for what was perceived to be their crimes. Burning at the stake is historically was a punishment for religious heresy. In some places, witches were considered heretics. In some places, nobody cared about their beliefs so much. It was more about what they were doing with their magical powers, and and they were convicted for their crimes. Hanged for the crime, burned for the heresy. But here's the thing. First of all, it is absolutely true that at various times in history and during various witch trials, people were burned alive at the stake. Jeanne d'Arc was burned alive. And we'll circle back to her as well. That said, the norm through the witch trials was to cut someone's head off, or strangle them, or drown them, and then burn the dead body at the stake to make sure it couldn't come back in some way. This does not, obviously, having your head cut off for something you did is still horrible. It's not quite as excruciatingly painful as being burned alive, but it's still horrible. It's more what was being done with the body, but usually, not always, because again, burning alive did happen, but usually burning was what they did with the bodies after they were already dead. At least in the case of witches, and for that matter, werewolves. One second. And the obvious question that will come to a lot of people's minds is, what changed? As I said, through a lot of church history, witches would let go. The idea of that there were witches was heresy. 14th century later, it starts to change. The church starts to get interested and starts holding witch trials. Part of what changes, of course, is the Protestant Reformation. And that plays a big role in this as well, and we'll get there in a second. But that's not the big thing that changes. The big thing that changes is an ice age. In the Middle Ages, people don't talk about this a lot, but in the Middle Ages, and the later part of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance particularly, the Earth went through a period of rapid cooling that essentially amounted because of volcanic eruptions. And this cooling that lasted for centuries, through, yes, Lisa, Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, was burned alive. I'm going to circle back to her story, although she was actually more persecuted as a heretic than a witch. Granted, it's a fine distinction in this circumstance. But, so Europe cools. Crops start to die. Animals start running, particularly wild animals like wolves start to run amok. This creates a serious problem. Because in the Middle Ages, and in the Renaissance, and in all through this period, the belief was that if the king was a good and just and righteous king, God would approve of him and smile upon his lands. The crops would flourish, people would be safe. So when nature starts to run amok, people start to blame the king. They start to think the king has done something to anger God. That's why the weather's gone haywire. Revolts start to happen. Uprisings start to happen. The people in power, which would both be the church, because the church held considerable political power at the time, and the various kings and nobles through Europe, have a serious problem. How do they control the people that are panicking? That's when they dig up this idea of using witches as scapegoats. And they blame the witches for the climate change. And start hunting witches and start executing witches. A common thing that you run into, particularly at this time, is this also gets into the birth of the Protestant Reformation. Catholics accuse Protestants of being witches. Protestants accuse Catholics of being witches. In countries that get taken over by Protestantism, convents are shut down. And this is another big problem. because at the time, they took a whole bunch of women, in a time when women had no power, generally couldn't own land, and were second class citizens, took away their homes, took away their means of sustaining themselves, outlawed their religious practices, and threw them out on the street. Now, at the time, that's interesting. Lisa Richard says, according to her research, the hysteria started in Scotland because a wench refused her master. That may be why it started in Scotland specifically, but the witches, I mean, the uptick in witch trials in general was fairly widespread. I find it hard to think that one single instance in any single country would have done it. It certainly probably caused a lot of the English panic and British panic, which also has some religious influences. But so what happens is these nuns are kicked out. Now, one of the things that nuns at the time often did know was a bit of herbalism and how to be a midwife, because convents were a common place for sometimes a common place for pregnant women to go. So they had to make a living somehow. They turned to the skills that they had, which made them local wise women, because they were usually among the more educated women in the area. The ones that had any experience with being midwives, being any type of medical experience at all, such as it was, and being Catholics, the Protestants couldn't stand them, which made them ready targets for witch trials. So again, it does not justify or make acceptable what happened, but there are political and economic reasons behind the European trials as a whole. Salem is also pretty much entirely economic, but there's a whole other kettle of fish and is far less justifiable than what happened in Europe, or at least far less understandable than what happened in Europe. So let me talk a little bit about Salem. In 1692, 9 children accused adults of witchcraft. 19 people were hanged. One person, Giles Corries, was crushed under a rock. And around 2 people died in prison. All charged with the crime of witchcraft. The popular story here is that the girls were hanging out in the house of Reverend Paris, who was a local reverend, and hanging out particularly with one of his slaves, a woman by the name of Tabuta. Tabuta was a slave from Barbados, and supposedly was a practitioner of witchcraft, or more specifically, a practitioner of voodoo. She cracked an egg, poured it into a glass, and the girls would look into it to see their future. Supposedly, one of the girls saw a coffin, thought this meant she was going to die, freaked out, and told her parents, and that's how the witch trials started. This story, as I understand it, is actually apocryphal. The first records of this story, Sabuda certainly was accused of witchcraft, and for that matter, pled guilty, and saved her own life in doing so. But there's not a whole lot of evidence she actually was doing this trick with the eggs. Not even sure how much, if any, evidence there was that she was into voodoo. The reality being that she started, that the story started 100 years or more after the trials. Now, why did the Salem trials happen? Like I said, it was economic. Mostly, really, though, it was greed. If you follow the records back, there's an interesting fact you'll find. The first the families of the people of the children that made the accusation were in land disputes with the first people that were accused. If somebody's accused of witchcraft, either one, they pled guilty, in which case they lived, but their lands were seized and held forfeit by the state. On the other hand, if someone pled innocent, they were found guilty, and their lands were seized by the state. Which is a disgustingly ruthless but efficient way to resolve a property dispute. This is also what happened to Giles Corey. Yeah, actually, I believe two of them said it was all made up a year or two later. Yeah, the reality is the whole thing was fabricated. It never. There were no witches. Actually, no, I take that back. There's some evidence there was some type of. They have recently found some archaeological evidence of some kind of magical practice going on in Salem at the time that doesn't necessarily equate to they were witches or that any of the accused were guilty. Because reality is Christians in the Middle Ages practiced magic too. We're gonna get there in a second too, because this is where this starts getting weird. Um, really weird. Hi there, new person in the chat. Hi, specifically the name of the person in the chat's I'm Satan. Hi there. Fascinating name. But in Salem, and technically it didn't even actually happen in Salem. It happened in another town nearby. It was a land dispute that got completely out of control. And the reality is about it is in time since then. That I like that. I'm Satan says many people, not many people knew that Albert Einstein had a brother that evil scientists used to experiment on. His name was Frankenstein. Um, Good one. We got into the story of the origin of Frankenstein in the last video, actually. But hey, a good joke's a good joke. But to come back to on track, there are two things that particularly happen that make the whole thing worse. One is that a year after the Salem trials, a bunch of officials from England showed up, reviewed the entire transcripts of the trials, said the whole thing was insane, and found most of them innocent. There were still a few people that were where the convictions stood, but they're like 2, 3 people. Unfortunately, because of the backwards laws at the time, many of the people who were in prison still had to stay in prison because the other thing is you had to pay for if you're in prison you had to pay for your housing, your room and board in prison, and if you didn't have that money, you got sent to prison. You got to stay in prison even longer, even when you were found innocent. The various girls that made the accusations, several of them later admitted the whole thing was a hoax. Two of them, I believe, wound up basically working as prostitutes. The whole thing was a mess. And yes, at least it says quite correctly. There was before Salem. There was Connecticut. There were other. Salem was the biggest concentration of witch trials that happened in the United States. There were other trials. I mentioned my favorite one, the one that happened in Philadelphia. So one other story I want to talk about briefly before I get into where this all gets really strange and bizarre, is the story of Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan, or as she's known in English, Joan of Arc, or the Maid of Orleans. Joan is a really interesting case in that she claimed to hear the voices of saints. Specifically, she heard Saint Bridget, which is interesting because Saint Bridget's actually wasn't an actual human. She was a pagan goddess who was later made into a saint. Thank you. I'm saying I continue to enjoy your humor. You know what type of again from I'm saying, you know what kind of jackets demons wear? Blazers. Not the most brilliant of jokes, but I find them funny. So you're welcome here. You're sinfully funny. But so Jean is a peasant girl, unschooled, unlettered, who claims to hear these voices. Bridget, a few other saints, along with Saint Michael, who tell her to seek out the French king at the time. This was during the 100 Years' War when England and France were fighting over which French king should sit on the throne. Because in reality, the English kings were also Norman. But she found the king. There's a famous story, probably true to the records make it fairly clear it was true, that she was at a gathering of nobility at court. The king tried to hide himself, and she picked him out quite easily on her own. She managed to convince the king that she was sent by God to lead his armies to victory, and he eventually rolled with it and gave her own command. Um, Jean fought in a number of battles. In fact, in her very first battle, she took an arrow to the neck, not the knee. This is not Skyrim. She got shot in the neck and kept fighting. One of the things I particularly liked about Jean is that Jean was a pacifist. She did not draw, as far as we know, she never fought enemies with her sword. What she did was quite a bit more courageous. She carried the battle standard. She was the person on the battlefield who reminded everybody on her side where the heck to go. What makes this courageous is when you carry the flag, you're standing out there with your both hands on the spear of the flag, holding it up, turning yourself into one hell of a bullseye. This is why she got shot in the neck in her first battle. But she kept doing it. She broke a number of important sieges, many of which were thought to be impossible, and eventually, regrettably, she was captured by the English and put on trial for the crime of heresy. There were a number of things that happened during the trial, some of which are rather awesome in their own right, and I'm going to get into those. But regrettably, for some very bullshit reasons, she was eventually burned at the stake for the crime of witchcraft. A year later, some years later, the Pope would declare the whole thing was a giant mistake and undo the conviction. For that matter, the man who was the executioner, considered himself damned forever for what he did to her. And then about a century after all this happened, she was named the saint. During the trial, what I find interesting and tragic, one is two of her answers at trial were actually quite fun. One is they asked her what language these voices that she heard spoke. Deadpan looks at her accuser and says, "A better one than yours." Further, she was asked a seemingly simple but very deceptively dangerous question. Are you in God's grace? Seems straightforward. Yes, really, Lisa, she did say a better one than yours. But she's asked if she's in God's grace. Now, this is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. Because if she says yes, that's hubris. How can you claim to know that you're in God's grace? If she says no, God is angry with her. Burn her at the stake. Done deal. Jean gives pretty much the only right answer. The only answer that doesn't end in an instant bonfire. She says, if I am in God's grace, I pray that he keep me there. If I am not in God's grace, I pray that he place me there. They didn't know what the heck to do with the woman. She had given a theologian's, an unlettered peasant girl, gave an answer worthy of a theologian. The trial wasn't going terribly well for the English. They even had to fabricate some things. For example, one of the stipulations that was made during trial is that she had to wear women's clothing. One of the great affronts to people at the time, of course, was that she ran around wearing armor and dressing like a man. She agreed to wear women's clothing. And then while in prison, the guards stole her men's clothing, and women's clothing, and only left her with men's clothing. This left a very pious, and as far as any records show, virginal young woman with a problem. Dress like a man, or remain naked in a public cell with male prisoners. Not wanting to be raped, she put on the men's clothing quite reasonably. But this was then turned around and used against her at trial. Now, an interesting question that's come up from time to time for me as a believer is, do I believe that Jean actually heard voices from God? And more significantly than that, why did God intervene in a human political squabble? I can give you two reasons why God would whether or not you believe that she heard the voices of angels and saints, or she was simply insane, or that was some political thing going on. I can give you two things to think about in terms of why God might have intervened, if God, assuming God exists. One is the conflict that she helped end, and she was an important part of ending it, even though it took some years after her execution to end, was the 100 Years' War. It wasn't called the 100 Years' War for poetic license. But there's another reason. From a psychological and neurological standpoint, temporal lobe epilepsy is one of the suggested things. But there's another thing that she did that has had a profound influence on history since her. The idea of people's right to choose who is in charge. Jean's story helped bring the idea of freedom to the forefront. She helped inspire both the American and the French revolutions. She became a symbol for centuries to come that had a profound effect on human history. Whether you believe that she had temporal lobe epilepsy, or whether she heard the voices of God, or whether she heard the voices of Satan, her story, her legend, had a profound influence on human history after her, for the better. Something worth again. This is hardly proof that she heard the voices of God. To prove that she heard the voice of God, I have to prove there's a God, that gods and saints and angels existed. I can't do that, but it's something worth thinking about. And here's the other thing: from an objective standpoint, whether or not she ever actually heard the voices she claimed to hear, the myth, the legend of Joan of Arc, is profoundly important, maybe even more important in some ways than the fact of Joan of Arc, because the way that legend has inspired people since. So let's talk, before wrapping up, because I've already hit my hour mark, but I'm going to keep going since I started tonight with the big announcement instead of the show. Let's talk a little bit about how this stuff gets weird. Pope Honorarius is a really good example. Some popes and theologians in the Middle Ages considered themselves so pious and so holy that there was no need to worry about earthly temptations anymore. But they wanted to test themselves. They took up summoning demons. Pope Honorius even supposedly wrote a grimoire. The grimoire exists, and it dates back to the right time period. There's debate over whether or not he actually wrote it. But it is a book on how to summon demons. And the story goes that he would summon demons just to see if they could offer him some new temptations to turn down. It gets even weirder than that, though. One of the most famous cases of witchcraft and demonic possession happened in Lodun, France. Aldous Huxley famously wrote a book about this called The Devils of Lodun. It was a convent that basically supposedly got overtaken by witches and demons. The priest in charge of the convent was burned at the stake, as were a number of other people. But the church got a really weird idea of what to do with some of the possessed nuns. So, Catholic theology since then has started to move away from this idea, but there was an idea at the time of purgatory, of souls that were trapped, that were and this is a common mistake people make about the Catholic idea of purgatory. Purgatory is not a place for people that are neither good enough for heaven or bad enough for hell. It is a place for people that are bound for heaven, who have some sin on their soul that they need to work off before they can go through the pearly gates. some unconfessed sin, something like that. But they are going to heaven. It's a stop on the road. Not no one in purgatory in Catholic theology. No one who is in purgatory is ever going to wind up going to hell. They've earned their place in heaven. They need to be purged of their earthly sins first. And how long you spend in purgatory depends on a number of factors. Two of the ways to mitigate your time in purgatory was one for people on earth to pray for you, and two was in life you can make big donations to the church, which is where this whole idea of pecuniary indulgence comes in. And I'm not a fan, obviously. Neither was Martin Luther. It's one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation. This idea of buying your way into heaven, which is But Eric, you have these souls in purgatory, trapped between earth and heaven. Church got this bright idea that these women, because they were possessed by demons, could see into purgatory, could communicate with these souls, and because these souls were closer to heaven, get information and knowledge from them. So for a time, some of them were sent around Europe with exorcists whose job it was to keep the demons that was possessing this woman in line as church-appointed soothsayers. That is one of the strangest concepts I have ever seen. But yeah, it was a thing. And there's one last thing I think worth talking about, which is fascinating to me, particularly because of how much it's become associated with Satanism, which is the Black Mass. So, medieval legend claims legend, I should say, claims that a inversion of the Roman Catholic rite of Mass was performed from time to time, where the crucifix was hung upside down. Urine, feces, and semen were used as the wafer. A naked woman was used as the altar. And of course, some modern occultists, particularly Anton LaVey, picked up on this idea and played with it. There is some record of it actually being done in France in the 16th and 19th centuries, or 16th through the 19th centuries. Catherine de' Medici was supposed to have performed a Black Mass. And a number of other ones were supposed to have performed Black Masses. But the Black Masses in question weren't actually an homage to the devil. It was a form of love spell. They were performed actually usually by priests to try to cast a love spell for the person who came to them. Because that's another whole other kettle of fish. The reality of, in the majority of the time, the people in the Middle Ages who were actually summoning demons and doing necromancy, summoning spirits to gain knowledge of the future, we have this idea of these weird shaman-like figures from pagan cultures that were doing these things? No. The people that were most, it wasn't peasants that summoned demons. A lot of the time it was priests. Because to be able to summon demons, to be able to do complex magical rituals, you had to be literate. You had to be able to read the grimoires, the books of magic. And by and large, the majority of the people in Europe who could read were priests. But there was this idea, like I said, that if you were sufficiently pious, you could do these things without damning your soul. It's a bizarre, insane idea, but yeah, it happened. And eventually, of course, as time progressed, you even started getting the idea of court magicians and alchemists and things of that nature. There is, and he is far too complex and fascinating, I figured, to spend much time on here, but there is Dr. John Dee, who was a magician, an alchemist, a summoner of angels and demons, who supposedly, among other things, not only wrote down and translated for humans Enochian, which is supposed to be the language of the angels, which in traditional theology is incorrect. the actual language that angels and God are supposed to speak in heaven is Hebrew. Um, but he wrote down this language in Enochian that he claimed was spoken by the true language of the angels. He even claimed to have found the true name of the devil. And aside from being a friend of William Shakespeare's, possibly an inspiration for some of his ideas, and probably an inspiration knew Christopher Marlowe, he was actually a friend, confidant, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and quite possibly a spy. Like I said, D is a really interesting figure, worth probably an episode or so in his own right. And there's a whole bunch of actual grimoires and various rumored things that still exist today that we can thank him for. But okay, we have gone over the hour mark. I think it's probably about time I call it a night. I want to thank you all for listening in. I want to remind everybody, if you missed it at the beginning of the episode, that May 16th and May 17th, starting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th, with me, and then at 2 o'clock we'll have Virgo Triad coming on. So I don't know when. And then again on Sunday, we are going to host a live virtual convention here on YouTube. The current plan is not to have it on this channel because we want to give it its own thing, given all the cool people that are coming on. But we're gonna create a channel dedicated specifically to it. But that, check us out on Facebook, Paranormal Encyclopedia. Keep an eye on here and of course we'll have more updates here and on Facebook. Since I only do episodes once a week, you definitely want to check out Facebook if you're interested in Wrath of Khan, which is what we're calling the convention, because it's easier. I'll be updating that more frequently than I make videos. But that's about it. If you like what I'm doing, if you're interested, I would ask that you like the video, subscribe, leave me comments. Positive or negative, comments are always welcome as long as you can keep a civil tongue. If you don't, I may get snarky at you. And thank you so much, Teresa and Lisa, and I'm Satan. If you're still listening, I liked your jokes, Lisa and Teresa. I enjoyed chatting with you. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lisa. That's a very good thing to point out. When I say 1 o'clock, I mean Eastern Standard Time. I'm in New Jersey myself, so everything's going to be based on that time zone. Lisa, I had talked to you about speaking. At the moment, the schedule's wide open. You'll be able to pick whatever time you want. So it'll start at 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock's taken. So you just pick what hour you want to do later, or half hour. You don't have to do a whole hour. Most of our presenters are doing an hour. You can do less if you'd like. But we'll talk about all that on Facebook. So yeah, like I said, like, comment, subscribe. If you happen to have a couple extra bucks, feel free to go to our Patreon, patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology. All that's linked in the description below, as is my email if you're interested in performing at this convention we're doing. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns. That's going to do it for tonight. Remember to tune in next week, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here, when I will be talking about possibly Witches some more, maybe something else. I'll figure that out between now and then. But that's going to do it for tonight, everybody. Good night, and God bless.